Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I gave a shout out to Howard Dragutsky, and now a shout out to Rena Konheim, the wife of one of my favorite rabbis. I hope he is well. I hope the family is well. In the first day of every class I teach at Union, I say to the students, you cannot explain the present by the present. Everything has a history. That's why we study history. So we're going to talk about, for the next 4 weeks, what I call the seminal event of the 20th century, World War I. One cannot understand the 20th century unless one factors in the way the war was fought, the consequences of the way the war was fought, and the political, economic, and social consequences of the war. Let me give you a hint at where we're going in this lecture series. We'll talk about the origins of the war, the causes of the war. We'll talk about the bloodletting on the Western Front, bloodletting on the Eastern Front. But what we will do, eventually, we will talk about Lenin's accession to power in Russia. The communist revolution of October 1917 is inconceivable without World War I. So too was Mussolini's accession to power in 1922. And ultimately, we probably will not deal with it in this series, but in the next series, which deals with the Second World War, we'll talk about the events of January 30th, 1933, when Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. Hitler's accession to power in Germany is also inconceivable without understanding World War I. And finally, in terms of, again, or penultimately, let me say, the decolonialization of the planet begins with the end of World War I. And finally, of course, here I drum into the students all the time, and we'll get into this again and again and again. You cannot explain the 20th century unless you understand the appeal of communism and the fear of communism. And all of that is going to come from World War I. So where should one begin? I'm sure you remember your high school and college history classes. It is at 11:15 a.m. on June 28, 1914, when a 19-year-old boy of Serbian origin moving into Sarajevo, comes into Sarajevo, hell-bent on assassinating the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. Who put him up to the task? And here again we see, one could argue, one of the first controversies about the war. Everybody knows that he was a terrorist. Gabriel Princip and some of his friends. We know that they were sent to the task by an organization known as the Black Hand. That was a secret police organization in Serbia. That much we know. There were officers from the Serbian army there. There were officers from the Serbian police that were there. That we know. What we do not know, have never known, unlikely to know, is that the Serbian government ordered the assassination. There is no evidence that it did so. Was this a rogue, what we today would call a rogue organization, the Black Hand, operating independently of the government? We are not sure. In addition to that, we come now to probably what is the major cause of World War I. That is the nationalism that permeated throughout Europe. So let me begin at the beginning. Hang on to me now. This can get very, very confusing. Please hang on to me. Of all the nationalisms that existed, probably the most vitriolic, probably the most pervasive and emphatic was that of Serbian nationalism. Serbia in the Balkans had at one time been part of the Ottoman Empire. With the ebbing of the Ottoman Empire, that's what was called the Near Eastern question, Serbia became independent. But there were Serbs that were not really content. They weren't contented with the Serbia that was created. They wanted a union of all South Slavic peoples. That included the Bosnians, included the Serbs, included the Croatians, and the Slovenians. Nearly all of them lived within the Habsburg Empire. I'm going to use two terms interchangeably now, the Habsburg Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They are one and the same. So the Habsburg Empire has lots of these Serbs, lots of South Slavs living in them, and the independent Principality of Serbia wants to bring about the destruction of the Habsburg Empire and create what came to be known as a Greater Serbia. So for years, the Serbs have been sending in assassins, trying to really disable, bring about instability within the Habsburg Empire. Once again, forgive me for repeating myself, but my second grade teacher in Brooklyn, Mrs. Grossman, always told me, repetition is the mother of learning. So here we go. The Serbs want to create a Greater Serbia. Most of the South Slavs are living in the Habsburg Empire. They want to bring about the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire. But from the vantage point of Vienna, which was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, in Vienna, they were always looking, going back decades, for an excuse to really sock it to the Serbs. Destroy Serbia once and for all, and we'll never have that problem again. So when the Archduke and the Archduchess are assassinated, in Vienna, they see a golden opportunity. I must tell you here, I move to the side, the Archduke should never have gone to Sarajevo. What is he going there for? This is a Serbian city, Sarajevo. This is a city that wants independence. It's a city that is commemorating a Serbian national holiday. Why is he going there? Is this hubris? Never minimize the intangibles in history. The hubris of people. Why is he? Does he want to really show the Serbs, put them in their place? I'm coming here. I'm coming to Sarajevo, which is part of the Habsburg Empire. I don't give a damn about your Serbian nationalism. He comes at 11:15. He and Sophie are assassinated. In Vienna, they're licking their chops. In Vienna, they want to make war against the Serbs. But in Vienna, they understand. Here we go, one of the most crucial moments in modern history. In Vienna and in Belgrade, in Serbia, they know that if the Austrians, again wanting a pretext, now invade Serbia, the Serbs have a rich uncle, or they have a protector, and that is the Imperial Russian Empire. Remember, the Russians are Orthodox, Greek Orthodox in derivation, but now Russian Orthodox. The Serbs are Orthodox, and the Serbs are Slavs. Russia, with its ideology of pan-Slavism, looks upon itself as the protector of all South Slavs, of all Slavs. So in Vienna, they have a worry. What happens if we invade Serbia and the Russians come to their aid? Who's going to help us? There already was a dual alliance between, again, the Habsburg Empire and Germany. This is the dual alliance, not probably, but part of the Triple Alliance. So a man, the foreign minister of Serbia, the foreign minister of Vienna, particularly the foreign minister of Vienna, they make it to Berlin and they talk to the Kaiser. And they ask the Kaiser, if the Habsburg Empire invades Serbia and the Serbs call upon the Russians to come to their aid, what will Germany do? What will Germany do? And the answer is the famous blank check, in which Kaiser Wilhelm II now tells the Habsburgs and the Serbs, to use the language of our contemporary period, we got your back. Whatever you do, it's all right. Germany will come to the defense of the Habsburg Empire and of Serbia, if the Russians come to the Serbs. I may have lost you here. That is, the Habsburgs are concerned. I go into Serbia. What will the Russians do? That's what they're worried about in Vienna. And what they get from the Kaiser is the blank check. Whatever you do, we're with you. And that is going to lead the Habsburgs to invade Serbia. The Russians mount a partial mobilization. The Germans get very queasy. You got to forgive me for being the professor of history. I've got to put you back in years and decades. In 1891, an alliance was formed between France and Russia. This is the Franco-Russian alliance. And if you're on your toes and you're familiar with the map, if you're in Berlin, you've defeated France in 1871. You know, the French want a second round. That's why the French have conducted this alliance, made this alliance with Russia. If you're in Berlin, you worry that in the event of war, the Russians will attack from the east, the French will attack from the west, and Germany will be squeezed in a vice. The Germans refer to this fear as Einkreisung, encirclement. We are going to be encircled. In addition to that, there is a phenomenon, again, one of those intangibles in history. That phenomenon is known as Russophobia, a belief that the Russians were barbarians, that the Russians will rape their way into Berlin. That's what they will do in the Second World War. The belief in 1914 and before 1914 is a belief that the Russians, if they invade Germany, will rape their way right through Germany. In other words, when the Russians are now announce a partial mobilization, forgive my crudeness, they're pissing in their boots in Berlin. They really are worried. And then all of a sudden, the Russians announce we are moving from a partial mobilization to a full mobilization. If they were worried before, they're even more worried now. That is in Berlin. So from Berlin, there is now an emissary sent to France. What will France do if Russia invades Germany and there's a Russo-German war? Will France honor its alliance with Russia? That's what the Germans want to know. And the French, in their inimitable way, give a very evasive answer. France will consult its interests. What the devil does that mean if you're in Berlin? So here we are. The Habsburgs have invaded Serbia. The Germans getting very wary, more wary when they hear the partial mobilization. Petrified now when they hear the Russians are moving from a partial mobilization to a full mobilization. And now the French are being very evasive. At which point in time, here we are, late July 1914, late July 1914. Here we are, and the Chief of Staff of the German Army, Helmuth von Moltke, now tells the Kaiser, we are surrounded. We are about to be squeezed in a vice. There is only one way for us to get out of this, and that is to implement the Schlieffen Plan. If you took a good high school or college history course dealing with World War I or European history, you know what the Schlieffen Plan was. Going back to the first years of the 20th century, the German High Command understood the possibility of being squeezed in a vice. Chief of Staff von Schlieffen argued there's only one way out. When it looks like war is coming, Germany must mobilize every soldier that walks and talks, every soldier in the reserves, mobilize them, hurl them against Belgium, go through Belgium into France, knock out France in 42 days, and then, using Germany's superior lines of communications, that's a fancy word for saying the railroad system. Then the Germans, having knocked out France in 42 days, will shift their forces from the west to the east and knock a death blow against the slower mobilizing Russians. Are you with me here? I hope you are. These are the dynamics. These are the immediate causes of World War I. Were there other causes? Of course there were. Was war inevitable? I'm a professional historian. I don't believe anything is inevitable. What were the other causes? One, of course, is nationalism is not limited to the Serbs or to the Germans. In France, remember from your high school and college history, France had fought Prussia under Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm I and lost. This is the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. And France lost in that war, the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. To show you, again, to show you what, again, those intangibles in history are. When Paris was occupied by the Germans in 1871, There was an American in Paris at the time, and he wrote back to relatives in the United States. He said, I saw something that I thought I never would see. The Germans never really took in battle Paris, but the terms of the treaty between the French government and Germany, the defeated French government, was that German forces would be allowed to march for several hours through Paris. And they do. And what is this young American writing? No sooner did the German soldiers leave Paris, thousands of men, women, and children, French women and children, Parisians, came out of their houses with buckets of water, got down on their hands and knees, and scrubbed the streets that the German soldiers had marched on. That's spooky. That's bad stuff. There are, if you've gone to Paris, there are statues of all of the various regions of France. There are statues representing Alsace and Lorraine. From 1871 to November 11th of 1918, those statues were covered with black crepe. France was in mourning for the lost provinces. And there was an adage that used to be said in France after 1871. Every Frenchman goes to sleep at night comforted by the fact that the French general staff is planning the next war, the next round, to recover the beloved lost provinces. Is that clear? This is important. You can't blame, as they did in the Treaty of Versailles, you can't blame the Germans for everything. They were primarily responsible for the war. They invaded Belgium. No question about that. But the French could have acted differently. And so could have the Russians. Why did the Russians go from a partial mobilization to a full mobilization? Do they want more territory from Germany? Do they want more territory from a German ally, the Ottoman Empire? Or is there something internal going on in Russia? We know in the summer of 1914, Russian cities were bursting with revolutionary fervor. The conditions in Russia were absolutely terrible. Everywhere else in Europe, the plight of the working man, working women, the so-called proletariat, was being alleviated. In Europe, men over the age of 18 could vote. Women could not, but men could vote. There were trade unions. Nothing like this existed in Russia. Russia was in a bad place. In Russia, the average working man in a factory in St. Petersburg or in Moscow was working 12 to 15 hours a day, 6 days a week. Everywhere else, the conditions of the factory workforce was being alleviated, but not in Russia. Russia was a pressure cooker seething with discontent. And don't you think there were people in Russia telling the Tsar, you know what? The best way to, let's say, prevent a revolution from coming is a nice, quick, short, victorious war. If we win and we win quickly, a wave of patriotism will sweep over Russia, and all of those soldiers, all of those workers, all of those people who are demonstrating against us, against the imperial government, in a burst of patriotism, will leave the factories, leave the strike lines, and join the army. That's exactly what happened. Interestingly enough, there was only one man in Russia, close to the Tsar, that told him not to go to war. The only problem with this guy was he was loony as a fruitcake. Everything you ever heard about Rasputin is absolutely true. Everything. Although there's a matter of debate in all of this. Rasputin was a defrocked monk. He was not a good guy. He chased every skirt that he could get, had sexual intercourse supposedly with large numbers of women. The wealthier they were, the more he liked them. But I'll lighten this up for you. There are some who said he was the best stud in Europe. And other women who slept with him said he couldn't raise the flag. So we'll never know, right? We will never know. But the problem was this guy was really not a good guy. And I'm sure you know the story about what happened here, why he is close to the Tsar. The Tsar had one son, a number of daughters and one son. The son had the royal disease, hemophilia. And the boy, again, anytime he fell, if he went to the doctor, went to the dentist, whatever it may be, there was the danger that he would bleed out. The rumor spreads that Tsarina, whatever the Tsar and that Tsarina were, he was an anti-Semite. She was smarter than he was, but very authoritarian, not willing to make any concessions whatsoever. But whatever you say about them, it was a good marriage, but they were a good mother and father. What's going to happen here is they hear in the grapevine that there is this man, the Rasputin, that can somehow stop the bleeding. Now, I am not a physician. I've told a number of physicians when I've lectured to them, they sit into my classes, they shake their heads and no. They say, there's no way he could have stopped the bleeding. They didn't have the drugs to do that at that period of time. Then I invited to speak to my class Robert Massey, the author of Nicholas and Alexandra. And what Massey got in Mintra, he wrote Nicholas and Alexandra because Massey has a hemophiliac son. And what he found out, they didn't use the term back in the 60s, networking. But he networked among other people who had hemophiliac sons, and they told him, there's a singing group. Now, whether this is true or not, the world is filled with Bubamites. Is this a Bubamite? Who knows? But here's the story that Massey told. When he networked, they lived in Westchester, New York, and they networked with a number of people who had hemophiliac children, and he was told that a singing group that was starting out, if you hired them, they would sing to the boys. They would calm them and the bleeding would be reduced. Is it true? Was it reduced? I don't know. Who is the singing group? Peter, Paul, and Mary. They were just starting out. Now, whether this is true or not, I cannot tell you. But Rasputin was loony as a fruitcake. He really was. He embarrassed the Tsar and the Tsarina time and time again because of his sexual antics. In fact, when the war begins, there's a rumor that he is having sexual intercourse with the Tsarina. It is not true. There's no evidence of that. But here's the point. He is the one man. He tells the Tsar, don't do it. Don't go to from a partial to a full mobilization. It will bring about war, and neither your family nor Imperial Russia will survive the war. He was absolutely right. But given the nationalism of the time, given the desire on the part of the Russians to demonstrate that they are a world power, a great power, he is not heeded. And then we come to something else. Was there one country that could have stopped all of this? Had it declared early on, if it had declared early on, what it would do in the event of a German attack upon Belgium and upon France, had they said really early on what they would do, could it have stopped it? This is something we will never know. But one of the, in terms of hypothetical history, historians have very wondered about this. If Great Britain had declared early on that if Germany attacks Belgium, England will go to war against Germany. Now listen to me very carefully here, please. Why would the British be so concerned? Well, in 1832, a long time before, Belgium was declared neutral, and England guaranteed the neutrality of Belgium. The British were concerned about Belgium because if you've ever been there and been to Antwerp, you know that Belgium in Antwerp has a great port. Here's a statement from the 18th century, coming in right to the present, right to 1914. Antwerp is the pistol aimed at London's heart. Whoever controls Antwerp, if a great power controls Antwerp, it will be able to launch an invasion of the British Isles. That's important for the Brits. And remember, I also told you, don't minimize those intangibles in history. Honor. When things start getting tough and it looks like war is coming, the French ambassador to the court of St. James comes to speak to Lord Grey, the British foreign minister, and says, we don't have an alliance with you. We have an understanding with you. And the understanding is that in the event of Germany attacking France, you will give us substantial assistance. Are you going to honor this? It looks like war is coming. Are you going to honor this? The French play that card of honor very, very importantly. And when the British cabinet meets, it wrestles with the issues for 37 days. Here I give you a parenthesis. If you're interested in what I'm talking about, go to the library, ask the reference librarian to get a BBC docudrama called 37 Days. It is marvelous. It is a docudrama depicting the arguments within the British cabinet from the time, again, from June 28th, 1914, to the British declaration of war in Germany on August 4th. Now, what do they wrestle with here? The honor issue is very, very real. And the hawk of hawks in the British cabinet, the hawk of hawks in the British cabinet is the young Winston Churchill. Churchill plays the honor card, and he does something else. This is not a Berk's law of British diplomacy. It's actually an axiom of British diplomatic history. England foreign policy is predicated on the assumption that no one country should ever be allowed to dominate the European continent. If any country dominates Europe, that country will be in a position to exploit the human and natural resources of Europe to mount an attack upon the British Isles. And the fear, what Churchill is telling the cabinet, if we don't stand by France and Germany wins the war, we are going to be confronted with a German-dominated continent. The Germans will control Europe, and the day will come when, in fact, they launch an attack upon us. That's an axiom that goes back to Britain in the 17th century. If you're really on your toes here, and if you were my students, let me tell you what I would do. Here I'm talking to you on Zoom. In the flesh, I go down to see a kid. I stand next to him and I say, what other country has a foreign policy that is based on the assumption that no one country can dominate Europe? Now, the kids go, duh. They go, well, they hem and they haw. But I have learned, if you are teachers out there, you know what I know. I've learned that a little bit of intimidation goes a long way. I can stand next to a kid and get a 30-point rise in the IQ. It doesn't last more than 10 seconds, but that's all I need. All I need is 10 seconds. And the answer is the United States of America. That's why we go, one of the reasons we go to war in World War I. That's why we go to war in World War II. That's why we take the cause of Europe against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. We can never allow another country, a powerful country, to dominate Europe. This is what Churchill is talking about. And the British cabinet swings into position. And in one of the most famous events, or let's say episodes in history, you'll see this in that document, the 37 Days. The cabinet has decided they're going to give an ultimatum to Germany. Germany has to withdraw its forces from Belgium by August 4th. If the Germans do not withdraw from Belgium, England will go to war. They listen to the chimes. It's the night of August 3rd. They listen to the chimes from Big Ben. We pass into August 4th. No response from the Germans. England is going to declare war. And Lord Grey, in one of those famous statements, runs something like this. He turns to his assistant, looks out, and he sees that the lamplighters are dousing the lights in London. And he says, the lights are going out in London and they're going out in Europe. Will we live to see them lit again? Do you understand what he's saying here? England is going to war. With all of that, are there any other causes of the war? Yes, you could argue the alliance system. There's the Triple Alliance, which eventually is, again, Germany, Austria-Hungary, or the Habsburg Empire, and originally Italy, but the Italians pull out, and the Ottomans or the Turkish Empire pulls in or comes in. Then there's the Triple Entente. An entente is a relationship, not a bona fide alliance. That's Russia, France, and eventually England. They come to be known as the Allies, and on the other side, they come to be known as the Central Powers. The alliance system is not a cause of war. I gave you the primary causes of war. But what the alliance system does is to guarantee that when war begins, it's going to be a world war, because everybody is going to be sucked in. In addition to that, there are other things as well. First of all, nobody thinks, these things take place in the summer of 1914. The records indicate it was the most glorious summer and the hottest summer in decades. People are at the beach. So while everybody is talking and the diplomats are talking, people are not taking this seriously. In fact, for a long period of time, people thought that war was inconceivable. It would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. What country could afford a protracted conflict? Nobody's going to be stupid enough to go into war. Well, people don't take it seriously. Another fact, and we'll deal with this later on, even people who are not working class people, people who are not members of socialist parties, and socialism is very strong in Europe at this period of time, they thought that in the end there could be no war, not only because it would cost too much, but the socialist parties of all the great powers would never allow the workers of one country to kill the workers of another country. We don't have to worry about war. But then on the other hand, there were people who said, you know what? No sweat in going to war, because it's going to be over fast. For example, when Germany mobilized in late July and early August of 1914, the Kaiser got out from the palace in Berlin and said, here's the famous statement from Kaiser Wilhelm II, you will be home before the leaves fall. That is, before September and October. We'll be in Paris. And what are the French saying? We'll be in Berlin by October at the latest. Everybody assumes it's going to be a quick war. That's not true, what I just said. Most people think there won't be a war. But those who think about war and who want war, they are the ones that think it's going to be quick and easy, so don't sweat about going to war. And then, here's something else I tell my students on the very first day of class. Never, never, never minimize the role of personality in history. Time and again, we will see key figures appear or disappear. Let me give you an example here, right? Here, goes beyond this. Not going off on a tangent, but just to make the point here. We are in February 1933. I'm jumping ahead just to make a point to you. February 1933. In a motorcade in Miami is riding the President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In that period of time, presidents were inaugurated in March, not in January. So here we are. Roosevelt is in a parade. He's the president-elect, moving through Florida, moving through Miami. An assassin steps out, fires at Roosevelt, misses him, and kills Mayor Cermak of Chicago by mistake. Whatever you think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and we will talk about that much later on, in the second section on World War II, the man is one of America's greatest presidents. It's either Washington and Lincoln, Lincoln and Washington, and Roosevelt is always third. And when it comes to the 20th century, there's nobody who comes close. Accident and chance are important in history. So you want to get an incident, why this is all important, why I mentioned this in World War I? Kaiser Wilhelm II, what can I say to you? Here, my Israeli friend Cheryl, I assume she is, whether she's religious or not, I do not know. You must have read what in Hebrew is called Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, right? There's a very famous statement in the book of Ecclesiastes. Listen to it. I'll give you the English. Woe to the country that has a child for a king. Think about that. Woe to the country that is a child for a king. Kaiser Wilhelm acted very childlike. He was mercurial, and now I know the limits. I know my own limits, my friends. So when I tell you that, the guy's got a number of hangups. He hates England. Now, why does he hate England? Well, he hates his mother. Now, why does he hate his mother? I have no idea why he hated his mother. But by virtue of hating his mother, remember, they're all related in one way or other. His mother is a daughter of Queen Victoria. So he hates his mother. And from that, we perceive that he hates England. He also, more seriously, but that's a serious factor too, he was born with a defect. He was born with a withered arm. He could not serve as a soldier. Does this make him more bellicose? I don't shrink heads for a living, so I don't know. But there are people who say that. And then the accident and chance. He makes statements. In the Boer War, fought between the British and the Dutch, or the Afrikaners, he supports the Afrikaners, infuriating the Brits. And what does he don't like about Great Britain? He doesn't like their Royal Navy. So the Germans begin to build an enormous navy. If you're in England, you look upon this with a great deal of fright. Why are the Germans already have the largest land army in the world? Why are they building a navy? What does it mean for us? That's a problem for the Brits. And he says silly things from time to time, again and again. Here's the accident and chance. He wasn't supposed to be the Kaiser. His father was supposed to be the Kaiser. But the father, who was a much more moderate man and a smarter man, died of cancer in the year 1888. That's a problem. Accident and chance are important. And then look what happens in Great Britain. Who's everybody's uncle? That's Edward VII, the King of England. He's the uncle of everybody and their wives. And everybody loves him. Everybody loves him. He is the great conciliator. If he were there in 1914, would things have turned out the way they were? We'll never know, because he's dead in 1910. So we don't know that. So all of these things are going to come into play. And then the Germans roll. August 1st, they roll into Belgium, implementing the Schlieffen Plan. Remember, the thrust of the Schlieffen Plan, they've got to knock out France in 42 days. The belief is the Russians are mobilizing, but they're slow, and we've got time. Knock France out in 6 weeks' time, shift our forces, as I told you, to the Eastern Front. But a number of things happen to upset the Schlieffen Plan. Number one, the Belgians begin to fight, and they fight fairly well. Who's the most famous fictitious Belgian soldier that you know? Do you watch the mysteries on Netflix? Hercule Poirot. He's not a frog, he's not a Frenchman, he's a Belgian. And a man who has been shaped by, it's a fictitious character, but he's in the Belgian army. The Belgians fight, they delay the Germans. It's very, very hot. And remember, we are at the dawn of the mechanized age. Lots of horses are used here. Everything is carried by horse. Not everything, but a lot of stuff is carried by horse. You got to feed the horses. You got to make sure that their feet are in good shape. The Germans can't move as fast as they can. And the Brits, and keep this in mind, because it's very important to understand the ultimate outcome of the war. What does England bring to the war? It brings a number of things, very important. It brings the vast resources of the British Empire. They can draw on the Canadians, they can draw on the Australians, they can draw on the New Zealanders. And believe it or not, with all of the talk about the antipathy that people in India have towards Great Britain, hundreds of thousands of Indians will volunteer to fight for Britain in World War I, as they will do in World War II. So the British have, and they bring that Royal Navy in. They blockade Germany immediately. Very important for what's going to happen in the war. And then the British have, of all the armies engaged, the British army is the smallest. Britain is the only country at this period of time that does not have conscription. It's a small volunteer army, well-disciplined, well-trained, and highly motivated, much like the Israeli army. In fact, the British are so good. One of the deficiencies of the British army, a knock against the British High Command, is they're slow in adopting machine guns. The Germans have more machine guns than everybody. The British are slow to adopt them. But British soldiers are so good that with their repeating rifles, they can fire, load again, and fire again so quickly that Germans on the field believe that, in fact, the British do have machine guns. The British and the French stall the Germans. The Germans can't move as quickly as they can. And remember, we're in a time without cell phones. This is important, a time without cell phones. Communications throughout the war are very, very difficult. German generals are not in, they're advancing some cases so rapidly. They are not in contact with each other. They don't know where they are. And who finds out where they are? A very interesting man. A model for us all, Papa Joffre, the chief of staff of the French army. Now, this is a man that we can all model. Don't get upset, Sherelle, don't get upset. People out there, don't get upset. This is a man that pisses ice. He's overweight, never misses a meal. The army is collapsing. The Germans are advancing. He sleeps, he gets his 8 to 10 hours a day, never misses a meal, and is unflappable. A lesson for us all. In times of crisis, don't panic. He perceives there's a gap in the German lines, and he shoves the French army. At enormous cost to the French army, they advance, and they split the German army. The German army is about to be encircled. This takes place at the river Marne, M-A-R-N-E. This is the most important battle of World War I, and perhaps the most important battle of the 20th century. Because what happens at the Marne? The Germans are pushed back. Had the Germans won at the Marne, the war would have been over. The Germans would have taken Paris. The war would have been over, and the boys would have come home before the leaves fall. Do you know what that means? It means that there wouldn't be 4.5 years of war. It means that the social, political, and economic fabrics of Europe would not be destroyed. The war would have been over. Germany would have won. Even the Brits. In America, who remembers World War I? If you've ever been to England, if you're ever in England on November 11th, everything stops at 11 a.m. Even if you're on a British airplane, they refuse, that you will not be served. The British remember the war. The losses are enormous. We'll come back to that again and again. The losses are enormous, absolutely enormous. So for a British historian by the name of Niall Ferguson, to actually say the tragedy, the greatest tragedy of World War I is that the Germans did not win at the Marne. Had the Germans won at the Marne, the war would have been over. There would never have been Lenin coming to power in Russia, Hitler coming to power in Germany. Never would have happened. The social fabric would not have been destroyed. The political fabric would not have been destroyed. But the Germans lose at the Marne. That's the crucial battle of World War I. Because the Germans lose at the Marne, what happens when two armies come like this? Two armies come, and there's no decision. The army that was supposed to advance, the Germans, are thrown back. What does it mean? When two armies come together and cannot break through, the armies try to encircle each other. They go around the flanks, but they can't do it. And so what's going to happen, and I'll leave you with this, what's going to happen is from the Swiss border to the English Channel, 250 miles. Armies that cannot outflank each other, they dig in. And so there are 250 miles of trenches. And the war that could have been over is now going to be a war of attrition. Who can stand the longest? And it will go on for 4.5 years. And the consequences of that going on for 4.5 years is what I already hinted at to you, and we will discuss later on. All right, Sherelle, enough is enough. Are there any questions?
Thank you. Yes, there are questions. So I'm gonna jump right into them. So the first one is about nationalism. And if you can say a few more words about like why it was spreading at that time. You gave the reason for the Serbs, but if you can give a little more about the spread of nationalism at that time.
It's hard. Nationalism really begins with the French Revolution in 1789. The belief, who is France? The people of France, they are French. And a belief that, again, a belief that nations have a unique character about them, and that nations have the right to dominate, let's say, the people of a country have the right to dominate, to run the country. It's not for the aristocracy, it's not for the kings, it's for the people. And that's important. So French nationalism is there, German nationalism appears, nationalism is there everywhere. Where nationalism takes a pernicious turn, more than you ever wanted to know. Here we go. The founder of European nationalism is the Italian Giuseppe Mazzini. Mazzini says the world will be a better place when each group of people have the right to create their own nation. The Italians should have Italy, the Germans should have Germany, the Hungarians should have Hungary, the Poles should have Poland. The world will be a better place because they won't be oppressed anymore, empires won't fight anymore. That's the theory. By the second half of the 19th century, nationalism becomes pernicious, becomes evil, because it's linked with racism. That is, we are not only different because we speak a different language in Germany than the French do. Our race is superior. That's important. Our race is superior. This idea of nationalism being linked with race is very, very important. The idea, again, of people have the right to have their own country, countries have the right to interact on the international scene, nothing wrong with that. But when nationalism takes on a chauvinistic point, that is, one nation is superior to another nation, one nation is based on this race and the other nation is based on an inferior race, then things become very difficult. Where it becomes difficult for the Jews is when nationalism is linked with anti-Semitism. When the argument is, you can't be a good German if you're a Jew. When nationalism is linked with religion, where are the Jews? When nationalism is linked with Christianity, whether it's Catholicism or the various forms of Protestantism, where are the Jews? The Jews are not considered to be. The Jews are not considered part of that nation. The Jews think they're part of the nation. What do the Jews say in Germany? We are Germans of the Mosaic persuasion. That's bullshit. Who believes that? Nobody. The Germans don't believe that. You're Jews. And in France too. Even though the French Revolution had declared that the Jews were free and equal with everybody else, there's still many Frenchmen. No, they're not like us. Their religion is not like us. That's going to be pervasive all over Europe. So nationalism is there all over the place. And by the end of the 19th century, it is talking about, really in a very bellicose way, national superiority, racial superiority, and all things like that. More than you ever wanted to know. Where does very often does this flow from? There are things that happen in the scientific world that spin off into the political world. What am I talking about? If you were my students, I'd ask you that question. But again, we got to finish before Shavu is here. I'll give you the answer. And the answer is, it's Darwinism. When Darwin spoke about superior species and inferior species, he wasn't talking about human beings. but there were the people that you studied in high school and college and university, the people known as the social Darwinists. They said that Darwin's ideas of inferior species, superior species, and again, natural selection, they called it survival of the fittest. And so what did they come up with? If we are the highest form of animal life in the animal kingdom, then the same processes that work in the animal kingdom operate for us. There must be superior species and inferior species of human beings. Only when you talk about human beings, you don't use the term species, you use the term race. There are inferior races and superior races. And that is going to lead, again, in many places, not only the Germans are not the only ones guilty of that, there are other people that think that their race or their country, based on a particular race, is superior to everything else. So, the answer to the question is, nationalism is alive and well, it is everywhere, and it is leading countries to move in a certain direction.
Thank
Now,
you. I'm going to jump into
let
more.
me just say, I'll finish before Shavuos. You want to see this, and don't take this the wrong way, my friends. You want to see a more innocuous form of nationalism? No insult intended. Don't ask how I voted. It is irrelevant. I'm just trying to make a point to you. We're changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, right? That's American nationalism. If that's the worst of it, we're in good shape. All right, go ahead, Sherelle. I'm here.
Yes, I'm going to jump into, we have quite a few more questions, so I'm going to jump into the next one regarding people volunteering or being drafted to the English army. Were the Irish drafted? That's one question. And another question was, why were Indian people volunteering to go to war with Britain?
Very good questions. The Indian people are volunteering, and so are the Irish, even though there's a lot of animosity. The conditions in India were awful, and so were the conditions in Ireland. You join the army, you get 3 square meals a day. You get clothing, you get camaraderie. And yes, it is true. That's why these people enlist. It's a place, again, where you can get 3 square meals a day. They don't know, and remember, nobody knows how bad it's going to be. No one understands this. So they join, absolutely right. And the Indians, hundreds of thousands of them, and again, the Irish as well. They will fight, even though, again, things are happening. That is in Ireland. So remember when I told you, was the war inevitable? I told you about the Russian Revolution. Suppose there had been a revolution in Russia in 1914. Suppose the Tsarist government, if it was not overthrown, was up against the wall. Would the Tsarist government, in the midst of a revolution, would it have gone to war, ordered the full mobilization? I'm not sure. In Ireland in 1916, there was a revolt in Ireland against the Brits. Suppose the revolt had taken place in the summer of 1914. Would Britain have gone to war? I don't know the answer. This is hypothetical history. You find it all the time in history. Accident and chance and timing are always very, very important. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Okay, there's a question to which I like the question. I'm going to ask it. You say if you want to answer it or not. But there's a question here. If Germany would have won the Marne battle, what do you think Europe would have looked like? That's taking you from the history to an imaginary future. But
I must tell you, Cheryl, and tell everybody out there. I'm a historian. I'm lucky if I get the history right. To prophesize or hypothetical history or to predict the future, I cannot. Germany would have dominated Europe. It would have used the resources. Would it have used those resources to attack Great Britain? I don't know the answer to that. A German now dominated Europe, well, would look, take what's happening now in Europe. The greatest economy in Europe, one of the great economies in the world, is the German economy. It's not doing so well now, but Germany is the dominant economy in Europe. The Germans, they don't control everything, but it's just a very powerful economy. Everybody has relations with Germany and so on. It would have been to the nth degree had Germany won at the Marne. Germany would have dominated all of Europe to its own advantage. That it certainly would have done. But again, the other side of that is, would it have been unpleasant for some people in Europe? The answer is yes. Would it have been make the British very queasy because where are the Germans going to go after they dominate Europe? Yes, it would have. But once again, forgive me for the third time, had the Germans won the First World War, there would not have been a Treaty of Versailles, which hammered Germany, led to the accession to power of Hitler. And remember, this we will talk about right at the end. The greatest myth in modern history is what is known as the myth of the Dolchstoß, the stab in the back, in which large numbers of Germans believed that our gallant soldiers were winning on the battlefield, but lost because they were stabbed in the back by the socialists, the communists, and the Jews. If Germany won the war, that would never have been. So again, it's a good question, but when you get into hypothetical history, you're really in a very difficult place. Go ahead, Cheryl. I'm ready for you.
Okay, we have time for one last question. There were actually a couple about this because you used both nationalism and patriotism at some point. And how would you describe the difference between them, at least in that time we're speaking of?
That's another very good question, I must tell you.
We have amazing learners here at CSP.
I have amazing learners. I'm teaching 57 years. I like to teach the mature people. So the question is a good one. What is patriotism? You salute the flag, right? You say the Pledge of Allegiance. You sing the Star Spangled Banner, or whatever it may be. You sing Hatikva if you're in Israel. Nationalism is a belief that we are unique. That we are unique, we have a particular destiny, and by the time you get to the 19th century, we have grievances that have to be addressed. Let me give you a term, a World War I term that nobody uses today, but the term is applicable today. The term is an Italian word, an irredenta. An irredenta is an unredeemed piece of land. So nationalism means, in the case of France, the irredenta is Alsace and Lorraine. For the Italians at that period of time, it is parts of Austria where there were Italian speakers. If you want to know what an irredenta is in our time, now listen to me carefully. Don't misconstrue what I'm about to tell you. The two most important irredentas in our time. One, for Pakistan, Kashmir is an irredenta. Do you understand? It's an unredeemed piece of land. Pakistan believes it belongs to Pakistan, not to India. And coming close to home, the most important irredenta in history in our period of time is for the Palestinians, the land of Israel. For Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah, Israel is an unredeemed piece of land. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Don't misconstrue this. Do not. They are not right. But here's something else I tell the students, and I tell you. Perception is reality. It doesn't make any difference what is real and what is truth. Perception is reality. Again, we're getting into something that Sherelle is closer to than I am, but we're all in one way closer to it. You listen to the pundits on television and they tell you the Arab-Israeli dispute is a very complicated dispute. It is in some ways. What should the borders of a Palestinian state be? What do you do with the refugees and so on? But underneath it all, and I won't back down an inch on this, underneath it all is one incontrovertible fact. A German Zionist said it in 1931 in German. Moshe Dayan said it in Hebrew in 1968. I will tell you what it is in English. It's the same statement. And it goes right to the heart of the issue. What we can get from the Arabs, we do not need. What we need from the Arabs, we cannot get. In other words, the underlying cause of the conflict is the unwillingness of the Islamic world in general, the Arab world in particular, to accept the idea of a Jewish state in even a truncated part of Palestine. That doesn't put me on any one side. I will simply tell you, we're talking about an irredenta. For the Serbs, Bosnia was an irredenta. Croatia was an irredenta. Slovenia was an irredenta. For the French, again, Alsace and Lorraine. Do you understand that? That's what nationalism, that's where nationalism is going by the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. It's more than singing the Marseillaise. It's much more than that. And that's the problem. Nationalism is an underlying cause of the war.
Professor Berk, thank you so much. I didn't get to all the questions, but it's lovely to know that we're having you back in the weeks to come. For those of you who asked, you will be receiving a recording of this program with a lot of follow-up materials to look at and more reading materials. And we look forward to seeing you next week and in our other programs. Professor Berk, thank you so, so much. This was amazing.
Hero, can I just say to the people, if you're inclined to do reading, the old standard, The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman is still a good read. It really is. There's a newer book, 1914, by the British historian Max Hastings. And then once again, 37 Days, the docudrama by the BBC. Thank you all for listening. It's a pleasure to be back with you again. Take care. Bye-bye.